YouTube seems to think that I'm interested in growth. Well, I have been doing a lot of research on the subject of growth, but mostly what comes my way is information about how to grow a YouTube channel. And I'm not completely opposed to the idea of growing a YouTube channel, but for me, the subject of growth goes far beyond just a social media presence or a channel online. See, growth is about becoming more, becoming the people that you and I can grow into and become. And growth is very important. In fact, it's more important than just getting bigger or going viral. And in a past life, I sold advertising for a while. I really believe that advertising can make or break a business, but we would often have to advise a potential client to be careful, not to get too much exposure. And why was that? It's because when a business has a lot of incoming customers and they haven't developed the systems and the teamwork to handle that business, more customers can actually be the death of a business. And so that's why growth involves more than just increasing in the number of customers or viewers or subscribers or any other metric. Growth is about becoming what our potential allows us to become. And it's not only is it an important element, but it's an essential element. Growth allows us to sustain whatever it is that we're building. I saw this in a small mountain community. There was a favorite little sandwich shop. It had virtually no competition until a corporate giant moved in a burger joint into the town. And they had a lot of fanfare associated with their debut. It was going to open on this particular day. And the local business owner was a little bit unnerved by it. He realized that a lot of his customers were going to go and try the new burger joint. And if they really liked it, they might not come back to his traditional little place in the mountains. So he was a fairly clever fellow. He said, I think I know what I'm going to do. We're going to close our business on the day that corporate giant opens for the first time. And he didn't tell anybody other than his employees. There was just a sign on the door that says we're closed. Well, what ended up happening was the corporate giant was overwhelmed because they had whatever business they anticipated having, plus all of the business that came from the local place, because there was no other choice. And what ended up happening, the corporate giant ran out of food, and the stress level on the newly formed team just overwhelmed them. In fact, many people had such a bad experience going to the corporate sandwich place that they resolved to never go back again. And sure enough, years later, that little sandwich shop is still thriving. Now, this video is not about strategies in the sandwich business, but it illustrates, that story helps us to appreciate that the reason why the corporate giant couldn't handle the influx, it was because they had not grown the infrastructure yet. They didn't know how much food to have on hand. Their team didn't know how to work together. And that same thing can happen to us. If we advertise too much, or if we go viral, if we have too much response, we can end up on the wrong side of that supply and demand issue. So the answer is to go ahead and grow and to become all that we can be as individuals. And as we develop teams, help our teams to grow and to become all that they can be. So in doing a little research on the subject of growth, I found 4 fascinating elements. And the first one is that growth is not linear. Now that flies in the face of some of the metaphors, because isn't it true that we very often use a picture of a ladder or maybe somebody climbing a mountain, and we use that as synonymous with growth? But that's not actually a very good metaphor because it's so structured and it doesn't allow for the reality, which is a lot of back and forth. We think about the way human growth occurs. When a child becomes an adolescent, it's not just a linear progression in beautiful, symmetrical growth. In fact, sometimes the teenage years are some of the most awkward years we have, but it's when the most growth is taking place. And so that's a better metaphor than climbing a ladder. Another one that might resonate is the way a beach forms along the coast. Now, when you go to the beach, you just see sand waiting there for you, and you may assume that that coastline is the way it's always been. But the reality is that beaches are always a work in progress. The sand is always either progressing or regressing, and the shape of the coastline is constantly changing. So the way a beach forms is by this in and out action of the waves relentlessly, bringing in sand, taking away sand, breaking down rocks, and so on. So the growth of a beach is a better metaphor for our growth as individuals. You see, if we're expecting growth to be linear and orderly and symmetrical, we're going to have disappointment involved. But if we could just get our minds around the fact that growth is messy, it doesn't happen the way we expect it to, now we can possibly be more patient with the reality of the process. The second point that I learned is that very often amazing growth is as a result of setbacks. So that should help us. You see, as you and I are growing personally, don't expect it to not have setbacks, and sometimes even serious, disastrous setbacks. So how can that knowledge help us? Well, when you and I do experience something that is heartbreaking or that goes completely against what we were trying to do, instead of assuming that it's the end of our goals or the end of our growth, assume instead that perhaps it's preparing us for the opportunities that lie ahead. And we might be wrong, but it's better to be wrong that way than to assume that it's the worst that could possibly happen. And I read about the city of Santa Barbara, California, which is a beautiful destination. In fact, if you haven't been there, it's a wonderful place to check out. But the city of Santa Barbara became the beautiful city it is today as a result of a setback. It was a horrible setback. In the 1920s, there was an earthquake, and it leveled about 80% of the buildings in the city. And then there was an earthen dam that broke, and the remainder of the city was flooded and set back to almost having to start every structure over again. Well, it was in that setback that Santa Barbara came into existence as we know it today. So keep that in mind. When you have a terrible setback in your personal life or your professional life, don't assume that it's the enemy, that it's working against your long-range goals. In fact, sometimes it's helping us to become the people that we can be, to grow in a very real way so that we can cope with the complexities of life and success. Here's another thing that I found fascinating, is that plateaus have power. Now, plateaus can be very discouraging. Let's say you're a musician and you make progress, you get to maybe the intermediate level, but you just can't get past it. You can't really become an expert. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a diet that you're on and you achieve a certain level of success and then it just seems to stop working and you hit a plateau. The same thing can happen with our professional or personal development. We may be doing well and have satisfaction with the growth, and then we stall out. Well, once again, instead of reacting negatively to a plateau, we want to think about the fact that many plateaus occur in a natural progression of things. For instance, when marathon runners are running a race, sometimes they actually have to stop, put their head down, take some deep breaths, drink some liquid, and then they're revitalized to be able to go on again. So instead of that break becoming the enemy, it may be the thing that allows them to finish the race when all is said and done. So just keep that in mind, that plateaus are part of the process. In fact, nature itself builds in plateaus. Think about the way winter works. It's not a period of growth, at least not on the surface. Now, underground, the soil is being recharged, the roots are getting deeper, but above ground, it looks for all the world like time is standing still. And that may happen to you. Something that you're working on may come to a complete halt, But instead of assuming that you're a failure or that it's never going to work out, interpret it as winter. And what follows winter? Well, for pretty much the last few thousand years, every winter is followed by a spring. Rejoice in the spring. Look forward to the spring and don't panic during the winter. The fourth thing that I learned about growth sounds much like a cliche. In fact, it is a cliche. It's embrace the journey. Embrace the journey. Sounds like a cliche, doesn't it? But it really is one of the keys. You see, if you and I are only in love with the destination, if we're not in love with the journey that we're on, then we're probably setting ourselves up for some disappointments or possibly failures. So get familiar with, get comfortable with, actually fall in love with the journey that is life. Now, these things are good to go back over again. In fact, just by way of review, growth is not linear. Growth involves setbacks. Plateaus have power. And we have to be in love with the journey, or else we are not going to make it to our full potential. Now, when it comes to the best moments in your growth, consider them to be still ahead.